Tonight we travel to the edge of the known world, to a time when the sea itself seemed alive with danger, when long ships slid through the mist like wolves through winter grass, and when the kingdoms of Western Europe looked to their rivers with dread. For upon those rivers came men from the north, hard-faced, salt-scarred, restless, and armed with iron. They came not as ghosts, though the frightened chroniclers sometimes made them sound like such things, but as human beings of blood and hunger, ambition and memory, carrying within them the old songs of Scandinavia and the violent intelligence of a changing age. Among them, somewhere between history and legend, stands Rollo, a name simple enough to survive 1,000 years, a name written by monks who feared men like him, preserved by descendants who needed him, reshaped by storytellers who could not resist making him larger than life. Rollo, the Viking who became the maker of Normandy. Rollo, the foreigner who carved a home out of the Frankish realm. Rollo, the raider who accepted land, baptism, and rule, yet never quite vanished into the world he had entered. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Where was he born? Was he a Norwegian exile, driven from his homeland by royal anger and blood feud? Was he Danish, raised among the war bands that haunted the coasts and river mouths of the West? Did he begin life as a nobleman's son, already accustomed to command, or did he claw his way upward by blade, oath, and plunder? The old accounts do not agree. The sagas whisper one thing. Later Norman tradition claims another. Frankish sources, written in fear and hindsight, give us only glimpses. The man at the centre of it all remains answerless, adrift to ponder, moving through history like a shadow cast by firelight on stone. Yet shadow is not the same as nothing. We can still see the world that made him. It was a world of cold seas and harsh shores, of timber halls filled with smoke, of kinship, honour, debt, and vengeance. It was a world where ships were not merely vehicles, but instruments of destiny. A good ship could make a poor man rich, a landless warrior feared, a chieftain famous. Across the northern waters, shipbuilders bent oak into elegant forms, joining planks with iron rivets, crafting vessels light enough to beach on sand, strong enough to cross open sea, and shallow enough to slide far inland where no army expected them. This was the technological miracle behind the Viking Age, and not magic, not savagery. Skill. Every raid began in craft and calculation, every coastal strike depended on weather sense, seamanship, intelligence networks, and disciplined violence. These men knew tides, currents, stars, and river mouths. They understood fear as a weapon. They understood speed as strategy. They struck not only with axes and swords, but with timing, rumour, and surprise. When the monasteries of the West described them as a scourge, there was truth in the terror, but terror is never the whole truth. The people of the North were farmers, traders, settlers, craftsmen, poets, explorers, and killers when killing served their purpose. They buried their dead with weapons, ornaments, ships, horses, tools, and memory. Archaeology has shown us silver hoards buried in the earth, swords pulled from graves, scale weights from trade, combs made from antler, beads from distant lands, and the material evidence of a world connected across astonishing distances. Through lithic analysis, metalwork study, burial archaeology, and stratigraphic excavation of trading towns and settlement sites, the crude caricature of the Viking as mindless destroyer falls away. What remains is something more unsettling. They were intelligent, they were adaptable, they were very often ahead of the kingdoms they attacked, and by the late 9th century the Frankish world was vulnerable. The empire of Charlemagne, once the great thunderclap of the West, had fractured among heirs, rivals, bishops, nobles, and ambitious kings. Its unity had cracked, its borders were broad, its authority uneven, its defences slow to answer fast-moving enemies. The great rivers that had once carried commerce, tribute, and royal power now became highways for invasion. The Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, the Garonne, names that once meant wealth and connection became names spoken with anxiety. Imagine the scene, a village before dawn. a riverbank wrapped in pale mist, cattle restless in their pens, a bell rope hanging still in a small church, then a sound from the water, faint at first, rhythmic, wooden, unnatural. Oars dipping together, hulls gliding nearer, men emerging from the fog in silence, shields along the gunwale, helmets dark beneath the morning sky. A child sees them first and does not yet understand. An old man understands at once. By the time the alarm is raised, the world has changed. The Viking raid was not just an attack on property, it was an attack on certainty. The church had promised order, kings had promised protection, lords had promised defence. Yet the northern fleets moved through that order like knives through cloth. They found weak points. They returned to places where ransom had been paid. They learned which towns resisted and which negotiated. They took treasure, livestock, captives, and information. And year by year, their ambitions deepened. The earliest raiders came and went, but later armies stayed. Winter camps appeared, fortified bases formed. War leaders began to look at fertile river valleys not merely as places to plunder, but as places to command. This was the great transformation at the heart of Rollo's story. It was the shift from raid to rule, from movement to settlement, from violence as harvest to violence as foundation. This is where the old categories begin to break. Was Rollo an invader or a founder, a destroyer or a statesman, a pagan warlord subdued by Christian kings, or a conqueror clever enough to clothe victory in legitimacy? The answer, as ever in the deep past, refuses to sit neatly in the hand. He was likely all of these things, depending on who was watching, who was writing, and who was remembering. To the monks whose abbeys had known the sound of axes at the door, he may have seemed like judgment from the northern darkness. To his own warriors, he may have been a giver of treasure, a breaker of enemies, a captain whose luck had not failed. To Frankish rulers, he became a problem too costly to solve by war alone. To later Normans, he became the necessary ancestor, the primal figure from whom their rights, lands, and greatness descended. But the man himself remains difficult to touch. No portrait survives from life. No diary opens his thoughts. No voice of Rollo comes down to us across the centuries. We have chronicles, legends, political memory, and the hard landscape of Western Francia. We have the Seine Valley, where power could be seized by anyone ruthless enough to understand its value. We have a Europe battered by raids and yet still capable of absorbing its attackers. We have a warrior who, at some decisive moment, crossed the invisible threshold between plunder and possession. That threshold would change the history of the medieval world, for Normandy was not merely a refuge for Vikings. It became a crucible, a place where northern aggression met Frankish administration, where old gods faded beneath church bells, where warriors became landholders, where ship raiders became cavalry lords, where a frontier people learned to speak a new language without entirely forgetting the sea. Out of this strange fusion came one of the most formidable societies of the Middle Ages, and at the beginning of that long road stands Rollo, towering and obscure. So tonight, among the misted rivers, the broken monasteries, the anxious courts, and the cold northern memories, we begin with a man who may have been born far from the lands he would one day rule, a man whose origins were disputed, whose enemies feared him, whose descendants exalted him, and whose life marked one of the most astonishing acts of transformation in early medieval Europe. Not simply the story of a Viking, not simply the story of Normandy, but the story of how terror became territory, how exile became dynasty, and how a sea king stepped from the edge of the world into the centre of history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where in the world you're watching from, and what the local time is, as we set sail into the storm dark age of Rollo, the Viking who built Normandy. Across the broken empire of the Franks, the 9th century opened like a wound. The great name of Charlemagne still echoed through halls, churches, courts, and battlefields, but the force behind that name had begun to fade. Once, a single emperor had seemed to gather Western Europe beneath the weight of his crown. Armies moved at his command. Bishops preached beneath his protection. Counts held land in his name, roads, monasteries, palaces, and frontier marches formed the visible machinery of an empire that promised order in a world still haunted by Rome. But empires do not always fall with one final crash. Often they loosen. A command ignored here, a border neglected there, a noble growing proud, a brother turning against a brother, a son carving a kingdom from his father's inheritance. The empire of Charlemagne did not vanish overnight. It splintered slowly and violently, divided among heirs who carried royal blood but not always royal strength. The West became a chessboard of rival kings, ambitious lords, bishops with armed retainers, and local powers who looked first to their own survival. This was the world that the northern fleets found waiting, not an empty land, not a helpless land. The Frankish kingdoms were wealthy, literate, Christian, and old in their institutions. The churches preserved books. Their estates produced grain, wine, wool, livestock, and coin. Their monasteries held treasure offered to God across generations. Their river towns formed knots of trade and taxation. Yet all this wealth depended on confidence. It depended on the belief that walls would hold, kings would answer, and armed men would come when the bells rang. The Vikings attacked that belief. The first shock was psychological. The men of the north did not fight according to the slow habits of Frankish warfare. They did not always seek formal battle, where aristocrats could gather banners, cavalry, infantry, baggage, priests, and oaths. They came by water. They arrived with speed. They vanished before the machinery of royal defence could grind itself into motion. By the time a count summoned men from scattered estates, the raiders might already be gone, leaving smoke, silence, and graves. The rivers were the secret. To a settled kingdom, rivers were life. They carried merchants, fishers, messengers, pilgrims, timber, grain, and royal officials. They fed mills and watered fields. They connected inland towns to the wider world. But in the Viking Age, a river could also become a blade laid directly against the heart of a kingdom. The Seine did not merely touch the coast. It reached inward, bending through rich lands toward the great city of Paris. The Loire opened deep roads into western Francia. The Rhine touched regions thick with memory and wealth. Water turned distance into opportunity. Imagine a Frankish watchman standing beneath a grey morning sky, staring toward the mouth of a river. He may have heard stories from other valleys. He may have known of abbeys emptied, altars stripped, captives dragged toward ships, holy vessels melted into silver. He may have told himself that such things happened elsewhere. Then the horizon darkens with sails, not black in the way later imagination loves to paint them, perhaps, but dark enough against the pale water, square sails swelling in the wind, wooden beasts with carved prows, lines of shields, men whose language sounds like breaking stones to ears trained in Latin prayers and Frankish speech. The watchman knows then that news has become presence. The raids were not random storms of rage, they were campaigns of intelligence. The northern war bands learned where wealth was stored. They understood feast days, market days, weak seasons, and political disputes. They knew that a monastery might contain precious metal, but little armed resistance. They knew that a town might pay to avoid fire. They knew that captives had value. They knew that fear could be harvested year after year if a region was convinced that resistance brought ruin and tribute brought time. To the chroniclers, this looked like divine punishment. Sin had drawn the heathen from the sea. God had removed his shield from a proud people. Monks wrote of destruction with trembling hands, recording flames, slaughter, ransom, and humiliation. Their words are precious, but they are not neutral glass. They are cries from within a wounded world. They tell us what the raids felt like, but not all that the raiders were. Archaeology and comparative study reveal the deeper system beneath the terror. Viking armies required supplies, repairs, leadership, negotiation, and discipline. Their ships needed crews. Their weapons required skilled smiths. Their movements depended on scouts and local knowledge. Their camps, when found through stratigraphic excavation, show not merely temporary chaos but organised occupation. We must see the Viking war host not as a mob, but as a mobile society of violence, trade, command, and opportunity. The Frankish response was uneven because Frankish power itself was uneven. Some rulers fought, some paid, some fortified bridges to block river movement. Some built defences around towns that had once trusted more in sanctity than stone. Local magnates began raising stronger fortifications, not simply as protection from Vikings, but as statements of their own authority. In this crisis, the shape of medieval Europe began to change. Power moved downward, closer to the ground, into the hands of men who could defend a valley, hold a bridge, guard a ford, or gather warriors quickly. In many places, the question was no longer who had the most ancient claim. It was who could keep you alive. The Vikings exploited this. Their leaders were not ignorant of politics. They played kings against rivals. They accepted tribute from one faction and attacked another. They made agreements when useful and broke them when profitable. They joined armies, left armies, returned with new fleets, and transformed the map of fear into a map of possibility. In this age, violence could be a language, and the most successful war leaders spoke it fluently. The Frankish kings were trapped in a cruel dilemma. To refuse payment was honourable but dangerous. To pay tribute might save lives today. Yet invite larger demands tomorrow. To fight decisive battle could bring glory, but also disaster if the raiders slipped away, or if rival nobles failed to support the king. Royal weakness became visible with every raid that went unanswered. Yet even weakness could produce invention. Where sword failed, negotiation might succeed. Where expulsion proved impossible, settlement might become strategy. This was not surrender in a simple sense. It was frontier thinking. If a warband could not be destroyed, perhaps it could be fixed in place. If a raider desired wealth, perhaps land could bind him. If a pagan leader threatened the river, perhaps baptism and lordship could turn him into a shield. Such thinking did not emerge from comfort. It emerged from exhaustion, calculation, and the hard wisdom of rulers who had learned that survival often wears the clothing of compromise. Across Western Francia, the old world of imperial command was giving way to a harsher and more local reality. Bells rang more anxiously. River mouths mattered more than palace ceremonies. Bishops negotiated as well as prayed. Counts became defenders in fact, not merely in title. Farmers watched the water, monks hid relics, kings counted enemies both foreign and Frankish. And beyond the coast, more ships were always possible. This was the stage on which Rollo would become more than a raider, a fractured kingdom, a rich river valley, a terrified but resilient Christian society, a northern military world that understood movement better than any of its enemies. The collision of these forces did not simply produce destruction, it produced transformation. Out of siege came settlement. Out of fear came policy. Out of the long terror of the Seine came the idea that one of the wolves might be made guardian of the gate, and still the river moved beneath the mist, carrying reflections of burned churches, royal banners, drifting ash, and the long ships of men who had learned that Europe was not a fortress, but a door. The Seine Valley lay open like a long road of water, bending from the grey northern coast into the green heartlands of Western Francia. To the men who lived along its banks, the river was work, food, passage, and memory. It moved past fields and orchards, past mills and timber yards, past villages where smoke rose from low roofs in the blue hours of morning. It carried merchants with barrels and cloth, priests with letters, fishermen with their nets, and peasants who knew its moods as closely as they knew the changing face of the sky. The Seine was not only a river, it was a vein of life. Then the ships came. At first, perhaps, a sudden violence, a fleet appearing where no fleet should be, a monastery caught unprepared, a settlement stripped of valuables, a bell clanging wildly above the shouting. Then the ships returned, and returned again. The pattern hardened into dread. The people of the valley began to understand that the water which sustained them could also betray them, bringing oars, iron, hunger, and flame from the sea. The road to Rouen was not merely a journey across geography. It was a movement from plunder toward possession. Rouen was an old city, seated in a place of consequence, where the river curved through lands too valuable to ignore. Roman memory still clung to such towns, even when stones had been reused, walls repaired, roads broken, and authority reshaped by centuries of change. A city like Rouen mattered because it gathered roads, people, tribute, trade, and church power. To hold Rouen was to hold a gate. To command the lower Seine was to stand with one hand on the throat of the river. For Viking leaders, such a place was more than a target. It was an answer. The wandering warband always faced a hard truth. Ships could carry men across the sea, but men required food. Weapons required repair. Captives had to be guarded. Silver had to be divided. Wounds had to heal. Alliances had to be maintained. Ambition had to be fed. A fleet that only raided remained dependent on movement, luck, and vulnerable moments. A fleet with a base became something else entirely. A winter camp could become a fortress could become a claim could become a country. Somewhere within this brutal arithmetic, Rollo's name begins to gather weight. He does not appear to us as a young man in clear detail, walking cleanly from boyhood into fame. Instead, he emerges as war leaders often emerge in early medieval sources, already dangerous, already surrounded by men, already part of the fear pressing upon the Frankish world. His life before the Seine is misted by a legend, but his importance becomes visible when the river itself becomes the arena of his ambition. Picture the war host drawn up near the banks, not in wild disorder, but in the rough order of men accustomed to danger. Ships pulled onto mud and gravel, shields stacked or hung, spears leaning against timber, fires smoking under wet skies, horses taken from nearby estates, captives watched by guards, smiths hammering damaged iron, leaders speaking in low voices while scouts come and go. Around them, the land is not unknown for long. Every farm, ford, storehouse, shrine, and road is observed. Every frightened local becomes a possible source of information. The Vikings were strangers, but they did not remain ignorant. Their power grew from learning. They learned which abbeys possessed reliquaries, jewelled bindings, vessels of gold and silver, and rents from surrounding estates. They learned which towns had walls worth testing, and which lacked the will to resist. They learned which magnates were quarrelling, which bishops had influence, which kings were far away, and which communities might pay for peace. The landscape became legible to them. What began as enemy country slowly became known country. This knowledge altered everything. A raid depends upon surprise. Rule depends upon understanding. The Viking war bands of the scene learned both. Rouen's suffering must have been immense, though the records do not allow us to reconstruct every burning house or every ransom negotiation. This silence itself is haunting. For every recorded attack, there were smaller humiliations and terrors that never entered parchment. A family fleeing with what they could carry, a priest hiding a chalice beneath a floor, a farmer watching strangers drive away his cattle, a widow searching a riverbank, a child remembering smoke for the rest of his life. History often counts treaties and kings, but the ground remembers footsteps. The road to Rouen passed through human fear, yet fear alone cannot explain what happened. If the northern warriors had only destroyed, they would have remained a passing calamity. Their true significance lies in the moment when destruction began to create structure. This is the paradox at the centre of the age. Violence broke open the Frankish frontier, but it also forced new forms of order. The very men who came as predators began to see the advantages of becoming landlords, tax takers, judges, defenders, and patrons of churches they might once have stripped. For Rollo, the lower Seine offered what the sea could not. It offered permanence. A war leader's greatness depended on reward. Men followed a chief who gave rings, weapons, food, women, land, and fame. Silver won in raids could vanish quickly, divided at the mast, gambled away, melted down, gifted to allies, buried in fear, or spent in markets. Land was different. Land fed households. Land produced dues. Land created inheritance. Land turned followers into settlers and settlers into a people. The Frankish aristocracy understood land as the foundation of power. The Vikings learned quickly, or perhaps understood already from their own worlds of farm and kin, The difference was scale. In the Seine Valley, a successful leader could transform from captain of ships into master of territory. That transformation required more than courage. It required political instinct. Rollo's achievement was not that he was violent. Many men were violent. His achievement was that his violence became negotiable. He made himself impossible to ignore and too useful to simply destroy. This is one of the hardest truths of early medieval statecraft. Legitimacy did not always descend from purity, justice, or ancient right. Sometimes legitimacy grew around the man who could hold what others could not defend. A king might hate such a man. A bishop might distrust him. Local lords might resent him. But if he could secure the river, if he could restrain other raiders, if he could turn devastation into a guarded frontier, then the impossible became thinkable. The Seine Valley was teaching all sides a new language. The Franks learned that negotiation with pagans might be less shameful than endless fire. The Vikings learned that baptism could be a doorway into recognized authority. Local communities learned that survival might require serving new masters with old fields. The church learned that yesterday's desecrator might become tomorrow's patron. Such lessons were bitter, practical, and deeply human. In Rouen, the old world and the northern world began to face one another not only across shields, but across tables, oaths, hostages, and bargains. Still, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the private conversations among Rollo's men as they looked upon the valley and wondered whether this foreign earth could become home. We do not know how many wished only for silver and return, how many dreamed of farms, how many missed the cold coasts of their birth, how many cared nothing for homeland so long as their leader fed them glory. We do not know what Rollo himself felt when he saw Rouen, whether hunger, calculation, wonder, or the quiet certainty of a man who knew that his wandering had reached its prize. The river does not tell us. It only carries the question onward. But across its banks, a new power was forming. Not yet polished, not yet named in the way later centuries would know it. A hard military community rooted in ships, fear, opportunity, and land. At its centre stood Rollo, no longer merely another sea king in a century of sea kings, but the man around whom the fate of the lower Seine began to gather. The road to Rouen was lined with ashes, but also with foundations, and beneath the smoke of burned estates, beneath the cries of towns that bargained for survival, beneath the cold eyes of warriors measuring fields they had once come only to plunder, the first shape of Normandy began to appear. In the fractured kingdom of the Western Franks, power wore a crown, but the crown sat uneasily. Charles, remembered to history as Charles the Simple, was not simple in the sense that later ears might imagine. The name carried meanings of straightforwardness, directness, perhaps even honesty. Yet honesty was a fragile weapon in an age of blades. He ruled in a world where kings were sacred in ceremony but contested in practice, where noble families measured royal commands against their own ambitions, and where every failure to defend the land weakened the invisible spell of kingship. The Vikings had made that weakness visible. A king could be anointed with holy oil. He could claim descent, law, tradition, and the favour of God. He could sit beneath banners, issue charters, reward followers, and hear the praise of bishops. But when smoke rose from the river valleys and armed strangers moved inland with frightening ease, ordinary people asked a simpler question. Who can protect us? This question is the iron nail driven into the age. Royal authority in Western Francia depended not only on sacred ritual, but on visible force. A king had to answer violence with violence, tribute with judgment, and insult with victory. Yet the Viking warbands were an enemy shaped perfectly to expose the limits of slow power. They did not always wait to be crushed. They shifted, negotiated, dispersed, regrouped, wintered, returned. Their leaders accepted silver, hostages, and promises. Then other fleets arrived, or the same men came again under changed circumstances. The problem was no longer a single raid. It was a condition. Charles faced a world in which the lower Seine had become unstable ground. Rouen and its surrounding lands were not merely damaged by attack. They were becoming a frontier zone where Frankish authority and northern power overlapped uneasily. In such places, written titles mattered less than armed presence. The man who could hold a road, guard a river crossing, collect supplies, and command loyalty might become more real to the local population than a distant king. This was the danger. It was also the opportunity. Charles could attempt to destroy Rollo and his followers outright, and such a course would have satisfied honour, clergy, and noble pride. But victory was not guaranteed. Even if one army defeated one Viking force, the deeper pattern might remain. More ships could come, more tribute might be demanded, more districts might be emptied. A decisive battle against a mobile enemy was a prize often imagined and less often achieved. The king needed another solution, not because he was weak in mind, because he was trapped in reality. To negotiate with a Viking war leader was humiliating, but kingship has always required the swallowing of humiliation when survival demands it. A ruler who cannot destroy an enemy may try to transform him. A raider who cannot be driven from the river may be bound to the river. A predator outside the law may be brought within law and made responsible for the frontier he once ravaged. This was the gamble. Charles would offer what warriors desired most deeply: land, recognition, legitimacy, status, and a place inside the architecture of power. In exchange, Rollo would become not merely a recipient of royal favour, but a barrier against future raiders. The wolf would be fed, named, baptized, and set to guard the fold. It sounds almost mad when spoken plainly, yet the early medieval world was filled with such bargains. Former enemies became allies, pagan chiefs became Christian rulers, mercenaries became landholders, frontier violence became lordship. The Roman world had done similar things with barbarian federates. Frankish kings themselves descended from peoples once seen by Rome as outsiders. History had long known that the line between invader and defender could be crossed when power made the crossing useful. Still, for the people of the Seine Valley, this bargain must have felt strange beyond measure. Imagine a farmer who had hidden his family from northern raiders now hearing that their leader was to receive lands under royal sanction. Imagine a monk whose house had lost treasure now being told that the dangerous pagan might become a Christian lord. Imagine Frankish nobles watching a foreign war chief gain what they believed belonged by right to men of lineage and service. The decision was not a clean act of mercy. It was a political wound stitched shut with necessity. At the heart of the bargain lay baptism. This mattered profoundly. In the Christian imagination of the time, political order and spiritual order were intertwined. A pagan ruler could be feared, paid, or fought. But to rule legitimately among Franks, he needed entry into the Christian world. Baptism did not erase suspicion. It did not instantly change language, memory, custom, or blood loyalty. But it allowed a new story to be told. The heathen had been tamed by the faith. The raider had bowed before Christ. The enemy had become a son of the church. Such language mattered because power required narrative. Rollo's baptism would not simply be a private spiritual event. It would be a public political act. Water would become a symbol of transformation, though beneath that water remained a man formed by the sea, warbands, and northern codes of loyalty. To the Franks, baptism could make him acceptable. To his own followers, land and reward could make baptism tolerable. To Rollo himself, it may have been less surrender than strategy. A door opened into a wider world of authority. The chroniclers give us fragments, shaped by later memory, of meetings, oaths, and ceremonies. One famous tradition tells of Rollo being expected to kiss the king's foot as a gesture of submission, and refusing to bend, ordering one of his men to do it instead. The warrior then lifts the royal foot so abruptly that the king falls backward, provoking laughter or outrage depending on the storyteller's intention. Whether true or not, the tale survives because it captures something essential. Rollo enters Frankish order, but not as a broken man. The story says, in its own rough way, that compromise had limits. The king could grant land. The church could grant baptism. The Franks could grant titles. But Rollo's authority among his warriors came from strength, not obedience alone. He could not appear too humbled without weakening the very power Charles wished to harness. A domesticated wolf is useful only if other wolves still fear him. This is the paradox of Charles's gamble. He needed Rollo to change, but not too much. He needed him Christian enough to govern, Norse enough to command, loyal enough to defend, dangerous enough to deter, and ambitious enough to build. Few political experiments carry such unstable ingredients, yet in the mud and mist of the lower Seine, among burned settlements, damaged churches, exhausted nobles and restless ships, the experiment began to make sense. Land for peace, recognition for defence, baptism for legitimacy. A kingdom could not survive on vengeance alone. A frontier could not be healed merely by remembering its wounds. Someone had to command the violence that had broken the region, and Charles chose to bind that violence to his own rule, rather than let it remain forever beyond reach. The decision reveals not a foolish king, but a ruler of a hard age making a hard choice. His authority was limited, his enemies numerous, his resources imperfect, and his kingdom vulnerable. In such a world, greatness did not always look like triumph on a battlefield. Sometimes it looked like sitting across from the man your people feared, measuring the cost of hatred, and choosing a future made from compromise. Charles the Simple's gamble would echo far beyond his own lifetime, but in that moment, it was immediate, practical, and perilous. A Frankish king extended the hand of power to a Viking warlord, not because trust had blossomed, but because necessity had sharpened itself into policy. The Seine had to be secured, the raids had to be checked, the land had to breathe, and Rollo, sea king, exile, predator, and soon-to-be lord, stood at the threshold of transformation, not defeated, not fully absorbed, but invited into history by the very kingdom he had helped terrify. At St. Clair, on the banks of the river Epte, violence was given borders. There are moments in history when the world does not seem to change at once. No mountain splits, no sun darkens, no trumpet sounds across the fields. A few men gather, words are spoken, oaths are sworn, land is named, duties are declared, and yet from such fragile ceremonies, whole countries are born. The agreement between Charles and Rollo belongs to this strange family of moments. It was not the beginning of all Norse presence in Western Francia, nor the end of danger, nor a clean line between raiding and peace. The past does not obey parchment so neatly, but it was a hinge, a turning point, a decision by which a Viking war leader was granted authority over lands around Rouen, and by which the lower Seine began its transformation into the territory that would one day be known as Normandy. The very name would remember the Northmen, not as visitors, not as raiders passing through smoke, as settlers. The treaty, as later tradition preserves it, was made around the year 911. The exact details are clouded by the limits of surviving evidence, shaped by chroniclers who wrote with agendas, memories, and political purposes. Yet the broad outline remains powerful. Rollo received lands in return for loyalty, defence, and conversion. He would acknowledge the Frankish king. He would protect the region against other Viking bands. He would enter the Christian order. What had been taken by terror was now held by agreement. This was not peace as innocence. It was peace as architecture, for peace in early medieval Europe often meant organising force rather than removing it. A ruler did not make violence vanish. He placed it under command, gave it obligations, attached it to land, and clothed it in ceremony. Rollo's men did not cease being warriors. Their weapons did not evaporate into hymns. Their memories of raids, feuds, voyages, and northern gods did not suddenly disappear. But their violence was redirected. The sword that had struck into the Seine Valley was now expected to guard it. Such a transformation required more than one oath. It required people on the ground to accept, endure, resist, adjust, and survive. The lands granted to Rollo were not empty. They were inhabited by farmers, priests, craftsmen, widows, children, landholders, monks, and labourers whose lives had already been shaken by decades of instability. These people did not awaken inside a fresh legend. They had fields to sow, rents to pay, dead to remember, and new masters to understand. For them, the treaty was not an abstraction. It was a change in the face of authority. The man who had once been feared as an outsider could now command in the name of order. His followers, once predators on local wealth, might become neighbours, husbands, patrons, rivals, and lords. This did not happen gently everywhere. Settlement is often a word that hides strain. There must have been disputes over land, language, tribute, justice, marriage, and custom. There must have been old resentments carried quietly into new arrangements. There must have been communities that bowed outwardly while keeping bitterness alive in their hearts. Still, a new order began to grow. The lower scene offered rich soil, navigable water, and access to both inland Francia and the wider sea. It was a prize worthy of ambition. Under Rollo and his successors, Norse warriors had reason to become attached to place. A ship could raid a coast, a farm could feed sons, a hall could gather dependents, a church could sanctify inheritance, a town could collect tolls, a river could be defended, taxed, and ruled. Land turned movement into memory. In this, the treaty did something remarkable. It changed the horizon of Viking ambition. A young warrior who once measured fortune in silver and sea crossings could now imagine estates, wives from local families, children raised among both Frankish and northern traditions, and a future tied not only to ships but to fields. The plunder economy did not instantly vanish, but it began to share space with lordship. Raiding was quick wealth. Territory was enduring power. Rollo's genius, if we may call it that, lay in understanding the difference. St. Clair was a legal act, but it was also a psychological crossing. For the Franks, it allowed humiliation to be renamed prudence. They had not merely failed to remove a Viking, they had recruited him. They had not simply yielded land, they had secured a frontier. They had not watched paganism triumph. They had brought a dangerous man toward baptism and Christian rule. Such narratives mattered because societies need explanations they can live with. For Rollo, the agreement turned conquest into legitimacy. He did not need to pretend he had always belonged. He needed only to make belonging useful and enforceable. Recognition from the king gave him a place inside the Frankish political imagination. Baptism gave him a place inside the Christian story. Land gave him a foundation among his own men. Defence gave him a purpose acceptable to those he ruled. Yet no ceremony could erase ambiguity. Was Rollo a vassal or an almost independent prince? Was he a servant of the king or a warlord whose obedience depended on advantage? Did the Franks see him as a temporary solution? While his followers saw a permanent conquest, the answers likely shifted with circumstance. Early medieval politics lived in the space between words and power. Oaths were sacred, but they were also tested. A title mattered, but only if men obeyed it. A grant of land mattered, but only if the grantee could hold it. Rollo could hold it. That is why the agreement endured in memory. The old stories around the treaty are thick with symbolism. Rollo is said to have taken the Christian name Robert at baptism, linking himself to a new world of saints, sponsors, and aristocratic identity. Whether every detail is reliable matters less than what the tradition reveals. Later Normans wanted their founder to be both formidable and legitimate. They wanted the Viking edge and the Christian crown. They wanted a beginning that admitted violence, but transformed it into destiny. This is how dynasties remember. They polish the blade, but do not hide it entirely. The treaty that made Normandy was not made in a library by men dreaming of distant centuries. It was born from mud, fear, exhaustion, calculation, and the urgent need to stabilize a devastated frontier. It was a bargain between unequal forms of power. Royal sanctity met martial reality. Christian law met sea king authority. Frankish land met northern appetite. The result was not pure in any simple sense, but history is rarely pure at its turning points. It was effective, and effectiveness, in the 10th century, could become legitimacy with astonishing speed. Once Rollo held Rouen and the surrounding lands, the work of transformation deepened. Warriors settled, local elites adjusted, churchmen negotiated. The riverside world began to look less like a battlefield and more like a principality in formation. The men who had arrived by ship began to root themselves in villages, estates, and political networks. Their descendants would speak differently, pray differently, dress differently, and dream differently. But the memory of origin would remain like iron under the soil. At St. Clair, the sea did not surrender to the land. It entered into it. The wandering violence of the Viking age became fixed in fields, Towns, churches, roads, and obligations. A war band became a ruling class. A threatened river valley became a frontier society with teeth. The name of Rollo, still half lost in fog, became tied forever to a territory that would outgrow him, reinterpret him, and carry his shadow across the medieval world. There, beside the Epte, a king and a Viking did not create peace in the modern sense. They created a structure strong enough to survive mistrust. They created a bargain in which fear became duty, land became loyalty, baptism became politics, and the lower Seine began to take on a new identity. It was an identity born from collision, but hardened by adaptation, an identity neither wholly Frankish nor wholly Norse, an identity that would become Normandy, and in that name the treaty still speaks. The Northmen came, the Northmen stayed, the Northmen built. The water of baptism did not wash away the North. It could not. A man does not step from one world into another and leave no footprints behind him. Rollo may have received a Christian name. He may have stood beneath the gaze of bishops, priests, warriors, and witnesses while sacred words were spoken over him. He may have entered the faith of the people he now ruled, accepted its outward symbols, and allowed the church to place his transformation inside the language of salvation. But beneath the ceremony remained the memory of salt wind, long ships, oath-sworn brotherhood, blood price, gift-giving, vengeance, and the hard northern logic of honour. Conversion in this age was rarely a private thing only. It was public, it was political, it was social theatre. It declared to the world that a dangerous outsider could now be understood within Christian categories. It gave priests a way to speak about him. It gave kings a way to justify him. It gave local landholders a way to negotiate with him. It gave his descendants a sacred frame in which to remember a violent beginning without drowning in shame. Yet conversion was also real in ways modern minds sometimes underestimate. The early medieval world did not divide belief and power as neatly as later centuries might wish. A ruler needed divine favour, a land needed blessing, oaths needed sanctity. Churches were not decorative buildings placed beside politics. They were among the strongest engines of legitimacy in Europe. They held memory, literacy, law, land, relics, and moral authority. To rule in Normandy, Rollo had to enter that world, so he entered it. But he entered as Rollo. The Christian Church had long experience absorbing rulers from beyond its frontiers. It had baptized kings, queens, chiefs, soldiers, and entire peoples across the centuries. The pattern was never simple. First came the ruler, then came his household, then came patronage. Churches were restored, endowed, or protected. Clergy were invited or tolerated. Marriages linked old elites to new ones. Children were raised in a different religious atmosphere than their fathers. Over generations, customs softened, merged, vanished, or survived in disguise. Rollo's baptism must be imagined within this slow machinery. It was not a magic doorway through which Vikings instantly became Franks. It was a beginning, and beginnings are unstable things. Around Rouen and the lower Seine, Norse identity did not disappear into the font. It adapted. Warrior loyalty remained essential. A leader still had to reward his followers. Men who had fought for Rollo expected land, status, security, and honour. They had crossed seas, faced battle, endured exile, and chosen a life under a foreign sky. Baptism might please Frankish bishops, but it would not keep a warrior loyal if his lord failed to give. Power still moved through the gift. In a Viking hall, a chief's greatness was visible in his generosity. Rings, weapons, feasts, fine clothing, horses, and shares of plunder bound men to him. In the Frankish world, land grants, offices, protection, and marriage alliances performed similar work. Rollo stood at the meeting point of these traditions. He had to satisfy northern expectations of leadership while learning to operate within a Christian aristocratic order. His authority depended on translation, not of words alone, but of customs. A ring-giver could become a lord. A warband could become a household. A raiding fellowship could become a landed elite. The change was profound, but not immediate. The men who settled with Rollo would have carried names, habits, and memories that marked them as northerners. Some may have continued to speak their ancestral tongue in halls and farmsteads. Some may have married local women and raised children who heard two worlds in the sounds of home. Some may have clung privately to stories of old gods and ancestral heroes, even while attending Christian ceremonies because survival, marriage, inheritance, and favour now required it. Still, the church was patient. It had time. Priests baptized infants, bishops blessed marriages, monks copied charters, saints entered the landscape, feast days shaped the calendar. Churches became burial places for families who wished to proclaim status and salvation together. The dead, once imagined in ship graves or furnished burials, increasingly rested beneath Christian signs. The body in the earth became part of a new story, one of judgment, resurrection, and sacred community. Archaeology teaches us that identity rarely changes all at once. Material culture can hold contradictions. A weapon style may persist while burial practice changes. A name may remain northern, while a charter is written in Latin. A family may claim Frankish titles while preserving stories of sea kings. Pottery, metal fittings, graves, settlement patterns, place names, and the study of human remains all reveal the slow stitching together of worlds. Genomic data, when available across early medieval populations, thus reminds us that migration, marriage, and cultural change do not always move in perfect alignment. Blood, language, belief, and law each travel at their own pace. Normandy was born from this unevenness. A baptized Rollo could sponsor churches without becoming a monk in spirit. A Norse warrior could kneel at Mass while still judging courage by the standards of his youth. A Frankish priest could condemn pagan memory while depending on new rulers for protection. A local farmer could fear northern settlers, then sell to them, marry into their households, or serve under their heirs. Identity was not a wall. It was a weather system, changing under pressure, shaped by necessity. There is a temptation to ask whether Rollo truly believed. The question is powerful, but perhaps impossible. Did he feel awe beneath the vaulted spaces of Christian worship? Did the chant of priests seem strange to him, beautiful, foolish, dangerous, or useful? Did he accept Christ as the strongest God, the God of the land he now ruled, the God whose priests held the keys to legitimacy? Did he privately remember older powers when storms rolled in from the sea? Did he understand conversion as surrender, alliance, protection, or rebirth? Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. No confession survives. No private prayer of Rollo reaches us. No witness wrote down the inner movement of his soul. We see only acts and consequences. He accepted baptism. His descendants became Christian rulers. Normandy entered the world of Latin documents, episcopal authority, monastic patronage, and aristocratic marriage. Whatever Rollo felt in the hidden chamber of his mind, the public direction of his dynasty was clear. The future belonged to fusion, and fusion can be more powerful than purity. The Normans did not become great by preserving Viking identity unchanged, nor did they become great by simply dissolving into the Frankish world. Their strength grew from combination. Northern aggression, mobility, and military confidence joined with Frankish landholding, Christian legitimacy, administrative habit, and aristocratic ambition. The result was a ruling culture unusually adaptive, hard-edged, and hungry. A people who could absorb, imitate, organize, and conquer. Rollo's baptism, then, was not an ending to the Viking story. It was its transformation. The old gods faded not in a single night, but under bells, marriages, charters, graves, and children who learned different prayers. The ships did not vanish from memory, but horses, estates, fortresses, and churches joined them. The Sea King became a Christian lord, and in that strange change, one of medieval Europe's most formidable identities began to take shape. At the font, water touched the head of a warrior. Around him stood a wounded land, a calculating church, watchful Franks, and northern men measuring the cost of a new allegiance. The moment was sacred, political, and deeply human. It held fear. It held ambition. It held the possibility that a people made by violence might yet become something durable. Rollo did not leave the north behind. He carried it into Normandy, and there, beneath the sign of the cross, the memory of the long-ship continued to move in silence, like a dark vessel beneath clear water. A new people does not appear in a single generation. It gathers. It gathers in fields where strangers become neighbours. It gathers in marketplaces where unfamiliar words are traded beside wool, salt, fish, iron, and grain. It gathers in marriages arranged for advantage, sealed by families who may still distrust one another. It gathers in churches where children stand beside parents whose memories belong to another world. It gathers in law courts, in harvest labour, in military service, in inheritance disputes, in shared danger, and in the slow surrender of old certainties. Normandy was not built only by Rollo. No land ever is. It was built by warriors who came with him, by Frankish peasants who remained in place, by priests who kept writing, by women whose names are mostly lost, by craftsmen repairing tools and ships, by local aristocrats deciding when to resist and when to cooperate, by children who grew up hearing more than one kind of story. The making of Normandy was not a single act of conquest frozen forever in memory. It was a living process, rough, uneven, and deeply human. The land itself demanded cooperation. The lower Seine was fertile, but fertility is not automatic wealth. Fields must be ploughed, ditches cleared, mills maintained, livestock protected, boundaries remembered, seed stored, labour organised. A warrior can seize a granary, but only a functioning society can fill it year after year. This is where conquest meets its first hard lesson. To rule land, one must understand land. The rhythm of the seasons becomes as important as the rhythm of oars. The Northmen had known farming in their homelands. Of course, they were not born from the sea alone. Whatever frightened chroniclers imagined, across Scandinavia, households depended on crops, cattle, fishing, hunting, trade, and seasonal movement. Many of Rollo's followers may have understood rural life intimately, yet the world of the Seine was different. Its fields, estates, churches, taxes, and lordly obligations were embedded in Frankish systems of power. To succeed, the newcomers had to adapt to those systems while bending them toward their own advantage. This adaptation was the true foundation. A raider takes, a ruler organizes taking. That distinction may sound cold, but it lies near the heart of early medieval lordship. Rents, dues, military obligations, tolls, and judicial rights had to be gathered and enforced. Men had to know who commanded them. Disputes had to be settled before they became feuds. Roads and river points had to be watched. Churches needed protection, not merely for piety, but because churches held records, loyalty, and local influence. Every village was a knot in the net of power. Rollo and his successors had to tighten that net. They did so not by erasing everything Frankish, but by using it. The church became essential. Clergy knew how to write charters, remember grants, define rights, and bless authority. Latin literacy gave permanence to arrangements that might otherwise vanish with a man's death. A warrior elite could win land by force, but written recognition helped transmit that land to sons and grandsons. A monastery might pray for a ruler's soul, but it might also preserve his legitimacy across generations. In this world, parchment could serve the sword. At the same time, Norse memory continued to shape the ruling class. Names, personal loyalties, martial values, and family traditions carried the scent of the North. Place names across parts of Normandy would preserve traces of Scandinavian settlement, not as a complete map of population, but as echoes of language and ownership. A farm name, a field name, a coastal name, a lord's name, each could hold a fragment of migration. These traces are quiet, but powerful. They show that the Northmen did not merely pass through the land, they named parts of it. To name a place is to claim intimacy with it. Yet the people being formed there were not simply Vikings in France. That would be too easy. They were becoming Norman. This new identity grew from pressure. It had to answer practical questions. How does a northern war leader govern Christian peasants? How does a Frankish community survive under a foreign dynasty? How do children of mixed households understand themselves? What language do they speak in the yard, the hall, the church, The court. Which customs are worth defending, which are quietly abandoned, which are transformed so slowly that no one living can remember when the change began. Languages mingled in daily life. But over time, the speech of the ruling world turned strongly toward Romance forms inherited from the Frankish and Latin environment. The old northern tongue faded, not because it was powerless in the beginning, but because numbers, marriage, church, law, and administration favoured the language of the land. This is one of history's great lessons. Conquerors may win with weapons, but children often belong to the speech of their mothers, neighbours, priests, and fields. Still, something northern endured in temperament and political culture. The Normans became famous for adaptability. They borrowed quickly. They learned from enemies. They adopted techniques, titles, architecture, and military methods when useful. Their identity was not fragile because it was not pure. It had been made from mixture at the beginning, and mixture became a strength. The Norman elite could be Christian, French-speaking, legally sophisticated, and still carry an ancestral pride in descent from sea kings. A people born at a crossroads often learns to move easily between worlds. Along the Seine, farmers may have cared less about identity than survival. Their concerns were immediate. Would the harvest be protected? Would dues increase? Would armed men take more than was owed? Would the church remain open? Would sons be called to fight? Would local customs be respected for them? The birth of Normandy was measured not in legend, but in rent, food, marriage, fear, and the safety of roads. And yet, over time, stability has its own persuasion. A lord who protects may be obeyed even if his grandfather was feared. A foreign name becomes familiar when attached to a local manor. A church patronized by new rulers prays for them by name. A child born under Norman rule knows no older order from memory. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. That is how conquest sinks into the soil. Women stand at the hidden center of this transformation. The records rarely give them the space they deserve, but they were indispensable to the making of a new society. Through marriage, households joined. Through motherhood, languages and loyalties crossed into children. Through estate management, dowry, kinship, and alliance. Women helped convert conquest into continuity. A Viking settlement without families remains a camp. A settlement with families becomes a future. The warrior's hall and the village hearth both mattered. So did the dead. Burial practices revealed changing worlds with a quiet force. The way bodies are placed in the earth, the objects laid with them or withheld, the orientation of graves, the proximity to churches, all these speak to belief and belonging. Across early medieval Europe, Christian burial increasingly marked community membership. A family choosing burial near a church was making a claim about salvation, status, and identity. The dead helped teach the living who they had become. Still, only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. There may yet be graves, settlement layers, isotopic evidence, and genomic data that sharpen the story of early Normandy. Stratigraphic excavation may clarify how particular communities changed over decades. Material culture may show the balance between imported habits and local continuity. Scientific tools may continue to reveal movement, diet, ancestry, and adaptation. The ground has not finished speaking, but even now the outline is clear enough to humble us. Normandy was not born from blood alone. It was born from negotiation, labour, memory, faith, fear, and the patience of ordinary life. The long ship brought the first shock, but ploughs, altars, marriages, courts, and graves made the new society endure. Rollo's achievement was made real by thousands who never appear in the grand tales. People who carried water, repaired fences, copied words, bore children, guarded roads, buried parents, and learned to live beneath a new name, a name that meant the land of the Northmen. Yet the land changed the Northmen as surely as they changed the land. In the misted valleys and river towns of the lower Seine, a frontier people emerged, neither wholly one thing nor another, dangerous because they were flexible, enduring because they could absorb, ambitious because they had been born from risk. They were the children of ships and soil, of baptism and blade, of Frankish fields and northern memory. They were Normans, and the world would one day learn to fear the power of a people made from fusion. The young principality on the lower Seine did not remain soft for long. It hardened. What had begun as a settlement of northern warriors inside Frankish lands became, with time, one of the most disciplined and dangerous powers in Western Europe. Normandy was not vast when compared with kingdoms. It was not ancient in the way Rome had been ancient, nor sacred in the way old Frankish dynasties wished to appear. Yet it possessed something more valuable than size. It possessed focus. The Normans learned quickly that survival required strength. They were surrounded by powers that watched them with suspicion. Frankish kings did not forget that these new lords had entered the land through violence. Neighbouring counts did not welcome a rising dynasty on their borders. Other Viking bands might test them, hoping to use the same rivers and weaknesses that had made Rollo powerful. Local resistance could flare. Family rivalries could divide the ruling house. A careless leader could lose in one season what had taken years to seize. So Normandy became sharp. Its rulers built authority through the tools of their age. They controlled land. They rewarded followers. They cultivated the church. They made alliances through marriage. They watched borders. They punished rebellion. They learned the language of charters, titles, and law. But they never forgot the older language of force. The result was a principality that could appear pious in church, polished in diplomacy, and terrifying in war. This combination made the Normans formidable. Across Europe, many warrior societies could fight, many churchmen could write, many nobles could claim descent from noble blood. Normandy's strength lay in binding these things together under a ruling dynasty with a fierce sense of purpose. Its leaders knew the value of holy approval and military obedience. They understood that a monastery could serve memory, that a castle could dominate a landscape, that a marriage could win what an army might bleed to take, and that a mounted warrior, trained and equipped, could break the will of enemies in the field. The age of ships did not vanish, but the horse rose beside it. This was a crucial transformation. The first Northmen had entered the Seine by water, swift and elusive. Their descendants became masters of land warfare as well. The Norman elite embraced the heavy cavalry culture developing across Frankish Europe. Horses, mail shirts, helmets, shields, lances, and disciplined shock action became signs of aristocratic power. The warrior who had once leapt from a ship with axe in hand now charged across fields beneath a banner, bound by feudal obligation and hungry for land. Yet something of the old sea-wolf remained. Speed, boldness, appetite, a willingness to cross horizons. The Iron Dukedom, as it became, did not grow from peace alone. It was forged in internal struggles, contested successions, border wars, and ruthless consolidation. The early Norman rulers had to keep their own magnates in line, a task as dangerous as fighting foreign enemies. A lord granted land could become too strong. A kinsman could become a rival. A minority rule could invite intervention. The duchy's survival depended on making private violence serve ducal power. This was never simple. Medieval lordship was personal. Men followed men, not abstract states. Loyalty lived in oaths, gifts, fear, gratitude, kinship, and advantage. A duke had to be generous enough to attract service, severe enough to deter betrayal, sacred enough to seem legitimate, and successful enough to keep ambition flowing toward him rather than against him. Failure invited wolves, and Normandy had been founded by men who understood wolves. The church helped tame the violence, but it also benefited from it. Norman rulers restored and endowed religious houses. Monasteries became centres of prayer, learning, record-keeping, and political memory. Bishops and abbots helped integrate Normandy into the wider Christian world. A dynasty with pagan roots could now present itself as a defender of the faith. Stone churches rose where earlier generations had known insecurity. Sacred spaces gave the land a new rhythm. Bells measured time. Latin words gave permanence to grants and obligations. Saints became guardians of places once scarred by raids. But piety did not make the Normans gentle. Often it made them more certain. They learned to cloak ambition in sacred language. This was not hypocrisy in a simple sense. Medieval rulers truly believed in divine order, sin, salvation, and judgment. Yet belief and ambition could march together. A duke might endow a monastery for the good of his soul, for the glory of his lineage, for the discipline of his territory, and for the political usefulness of grateful monks. Human motives rarely travel alone. In the Norman world, holiness and hardness shared the same road. Castles marked another stage in this hardening. Fortified sites allowed lords to dominate surrounding country, store supplies, shelter armed men, and impose authority. A castle was not just a defensive structure, it was a statement. It told every farmer, traveller, monk, merchant, and rival noble who commanded the landscape. Earth, timber, and later stone became political language. From such places, dues could be collected, roads watched, judgments enforced, and rebellion strangled before it matured. The duchy became a machine of controlled violence, not perfectly controlled. No medieval principality was, but more controlled than many. This discipline would become one of the hallmarks of Norman power. They were not merely fierce, they were organised. They could coordinate landholding, military service, church patronage, and dynastic memory with unusual effectiveness. Their society rewarded aggression, but also trained it. It gave ambitious men outlets, service to the duke, campaigns beyond the frontier, marriage into useful families, patronage of religious houses, and the acquisition of new land all became ways to prevent the warrior class from tearing the duchy apart. Ambition needed direction. Normandy provided it. As generations passed, the descendants of settlers began to look less like foreign intruders and more like native lords of a distinct land. Their language had changed, their religious life had changed, their political forms had changed, yet their origin story remained useful. To be Norman was to belong to a people born from conquest, baptized into legitimacy and sharpened by frontier necessity. Their identity did not apologize for violence. It refined it. This refinement is what made them so dangerous. A reckless warrior may win a raid. A disciplined warrior aristocracy can win kingdoms. The Normans became specialists in the art of turning opportunity into dominion. They studied their neighbours, adopted superior methods, and discarded what no longer served them. They could be loyal vassals when loyalty enriched them, rebels when rebellion tempted them, pilgrims when piety called, mercenaries when fortune beckoned, conquerors when weakness opened a door. Their genius lay not in inventing everything anew, but in absorbing everything useful and making it sharper. Within Normandy, ducal authority grew around a sacred family memory reaching back to Rollo. The founder's shadow gave the ruling house a primal legitimacy. He had taken the land. He had made the first bargain. He had crossed from the wild sea into Christian lordship. His descendants could claim not only legal rights, but heroic origin. Such stories mattered deeply. They told warriors why they served. They told monks what to record. They told rivals that the Norman house was not accidental, but destined. Still, the ground beneath every dynasty is unstable. Power must be remade in every generation. A weak heir can undo a strong father's work. A child ruler can invite predators. A proud noble can fracture a realm. Normandy endured because its institutions, habits, and ruling culture grew strong enough to survive danger. It became not merely the possession of one man, but a political organism, lean, ambitious, and alert. The Iron Dukedom emerged from the meeting of river, sword, altar, and field. It was Christian, but born from pagan memory. It was French-speaking, but proud of northern descent. It was feudal, but restless beyond its borders. It loved order, but fed on expansion. It built churches and trained killers. It copied charters and sharpened lances. It honoured saints and celebrated war leaders. It was, in every sense, a child of contradiction. And contradictions often produce history's most powerful peoples. By the time Normandy stood firmly among the powers of Western Europe, the age of Rollo had passed into legend. Yet his world had not vanished. It had changed shape. The longship had become the cavalry charge. The raiding band had become the ducal host. The winter camp had become the castle. The oath around a war chief had become aristocratic service to a prince. The sea-wolf had learned to wear iron, speak law, endow monasteries, and rule from stone. That was Normandy's gift to the medieval world, and its warning. The power born on the Seine did not remain on the Seine. It spread. Normandy, once a frontier experiment, became a launching ground for one of the most astonishing expansions of the medieval age. The descendants of Rollo and the society they commanded did not simply guard their own fields, churches, markets, and river roads. They looked outward. Their eyes moved across waters, borders, mountains, and kingdoms. They carried with them a particular inheritance, the courage of raiders, the discipline of landed lords, the sanction of Christianity, and the restless hunger of men trained to believe that fortune belonged to the bold. The Norman world was never content with stillness. This is one of the great continuities from the Viking past. The ships had once crossed cold seas in search of silver, captives, fame, and land. The later Normans crossed Europe in search of lordships, marriages, mercenary contracts, pilgrim roads, and kingdoms. The method changed. The ambition remained. Where the first Northmen had appeared at river mouths beneath square sails, their descendants rode beneath banners, spoke the language of courts, negotiated with popes and princes, and signed charters in a Latin. Yet the ancient instinct was still there. Move toward opportunity. Strike before others understand. Make conquest lawful once victory is won. The Normans mastered this art with frightening brilliance. Their homeland could not absorb every ambitious son. In a society of lords, warriors, inheritance, and prestige, younger men often found themselves hungry for advancement. Not all could become great landholders in Normandy itself. Not all could inherit enough to satisfy the appetite bred into them by birth and training. Such men became the cutting edge of expansion. They took service abroad. They fought for rulers who needed disciplined cavalry. They joined campaigns in lands whose languages, customs, and politics they quickly learned to exploit. In this way, Norman ambition became mobile. It flowed into southern Italy, where bands of Norman warriors first appeared as pilgrims, mercenaries, and opportunists among a fractured world of Lombard princes, Byzantine officials, Muslim powers, papal interests, and local rivalries. They arrived in small numbers, but numbers are not always destiny. Organisation, courage, and timing can matter more. The Normans fought for one lord, then against another. They accepted payment, gained land, built alliances, and slowly ceased being hired swords, and they became masters. Southern Italy was a mirror of their own beginning, but on a grander and more complex stage. There, as in the Seine Valley, outsiders entered a divided world and learned its weaknesses. There, as in Normandy, violence became legitimacy. There, as in Normandy, men who came to fight stayed to rule. Castles rose, marriages were arranged, churches were endowed, titles were gathered. What had begun as service became dominion. The Norman genius for adaptation revealed itself again, not as an accident of one region, but as a cultural habit. They could enter another world and learn its grammar. Then they could command it. In time, Norman power in the south reached Sicily, an island of extraordinary wealth and layered civilizations. Greek, Latin, Arab, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Byzantine, Lombard, and Mediterranean worlds had all left marks upon it. To rule such a place required more than brute strength. It required administration, tolerance when useful, cruelty when needed, and a willingness to draw talent from different peoples. The Normans proved capable of this. They did not arrive as simple destroyers of complexity. They became managers of it. The result was dazzling. In Sicily, Norman rulers presided over a kingdom where different artistic, linguistic, religious, and administrative traditions mingled beneath royal power. The old Viking hunger had travelled far from the northern seas. It now sat beneath Mediterranean light, among palaces, mosaics, scholars, fleets, markets, and churches. The descendants of northern raiders became kings in a world of citrus groves, stone cities, Arabic science, Greek craftsmen, Latin clergy, and shimmering coastal horizons. Still, the most famous explosion of Norman power came from the homeland itself. England. Across the Channel lay a kingdom wealthy, organised, and politically vulnerable at the wrong moment. The Norman Duke William, later known as the Conqueror, was a descendant of Rollo's line. Though centuries had changed everything around that descent, he was no pagan raider. He was a Christian prince, ruthless, legally minded, militarily disciplined, and consumed by his claim to the English throne. In him, the Norman tradition reached one of its most formidable expressions. The invasion of England in 1066 was not a Viking raid in the old sense. It was something colder. It was planned conquest. Ships were gathered, but they carried cavalry, archers, infantry, supplies, craftsmen, and the machinery of aristocratic war. Banners were blessed, claims were proclaimed, political arguments were sharpened alongside blades. William did not come merely to plunder English monasteries and sail away with silver. He came to take a kingdom, replace its ruling class, dominate its land, and write his victory into law. Here the transformation from Rollo's world becomes unmistakable. The longship had become an invasion fleet. The warband had become an army. The Sea King had become a duke with papal favour and legal claims. The plunder of churches had become the building of churches. The seizure of land had become a documented redistribution of an entire realm. At Hastings, Norman cavalry and infantry fought through a long and brutal day against the army of King Harold. The battle was not inevitable in its outcome. No battle is. Men died in confusion, courage, exhaustion, and terror. Shields broke, horses screamed, arrows fell, commands were misunderstood, bodies pressed against bodies beneath the autumn sky. At the centre of it all lay the fate of England, though the men in the crush may have thought only of the next breath, the next blow, the next step backward or forward. When Harold fell and William prevailed, the consequences were immense. Norman rule remade England's aristocracy. Castles rose across the land, not only as fortresses but as symbols of occupation. Bishops were replaced, lands were transferred, the English elite was broken, absorbed, or driven aside. Law, language, architecture, warfare, and government all changed. The Norman victory did not erase England, but it transformed it profoundly. A people born from the settlement of Viking warriors in Frankish lands now ruled an island kingdom whose future would shape the world. And behind that conquest, far back in the genealogical mist, stood Rollo, not as the direct architect of William's invasion, not as a man who could have imagined every consequence, but as the first stone in a structure that rose far beyond him. This is how legacy works in deep history. The founder lights a fire, later generations build furnaces from it. Rollo sought land, security, power, and recognition in the lower Seine. His descendants inherited more than territory. They inherited a political culture forged from adaptation and ambition. They learned that foreignness could become legitimacy, that violence could become law, that conquest could become order, that a ruler could be both outsider and founder if he survived long enough to make memory serve him. The Normans carried this lesson everywhere. In England, in southern Italy, in Sicily, in the crusading East, in borderlands and courts across Europe. They appeared as soldiers, builders, patrons, conquerors, and administrators. They were never numerous enough to dominate by numbers alone. Their power came from concentration, discipline, elite cohesion, and the ability to insert themselves into fractured political landscapes. They were experts in the art of arrival. They came as guests. They stayed as lords. But conquest always carries a shadow. For every castle razed, there were local people forced to labour beneath it. For every charter of possession, there were families dispossessed. For every church endowed by a victorious lord, there were graves filled by the violence that made his victory possible. The Norman story is not a clean song of greatness. It is a storm of brilliance and brutality, order and oppression, courage and hunger. To admire their achievement without hearing the cries beneath it would be to mistake history for heraldry. Still, their impact cannot be denied. From a contested settlement on the Seine grew a people who altered the direction of medieval Europe. They helped reshape England, transformed southern Italy and Sicily, influenced crusading states, and carried a model of aristocratic expansion across borders. Their castles changed landscape, their churches changed skylines, their legal habits changed governance, Their appetite changed maps. All of this began with the strange alchemy of Normandy, a land made when Vikings became Christians, raiders became rulers, and a frontier became a principality. Rollo's descendants did not merely preserve what he gained, they multiplied it. They took the restless energy of the north, disciplined it through land and faith, armed it with cavalry, clothed it in law, and released it upon the world. The Sea King's shadow crossed the Channel. It crossed the Alps. It crossed the Mediterranean, and wherever it fell, kingdoms trembled. Rollo stands at the far edge of vision, not gone. Exactly. Few founders are ever truly gone. They remain in names, borders, bloodlines, legends, ruins, legal memories, and the political imagination of peoples who come long after them. Yet he is not fully present either. He does not step toward us with a voice we can hear plainly. He does not explain himself. He does not confess his fears, ambitions, doubts, cruelties, or hopes. He remains a figure seen through mist, immense because history made him so, uncertain because the record refuses to yield everything. This is the fate of many who changed the world. They are remembered more clearly for what followed them than for what they felt. Rollo's life became a bridge between worlds. On one side, the cold northern seas, the long ship, the war band, the old bonds of honour, the brutal freedom of the raider, and the hunger of men who looked upon wealthy kingdoms as fields ready for harvest. On the other side, Christian lordship, land grants, churches, charters, dynastic succession, cavalry warfare, and the disciplined ambition of medieval princes. He did not belong entirely to either world. That is why he matters. A man fully of one age may die with that age. A man standing between ages can become a doorway. Normandy was that doorway made real in earth and law. It was not an idea floating above the ground. It was a place of rivers, roads, farms, churches, forests, harbours, estates, and graves. It was worked by hands that never entered the chronicles. It was shaped by women whose marriages bound enemies into kin. It was defended by warriors who learned to serve land rather than only sail for plunder. It was blessed, recorded, taxed, contested, inherited, and remembered. The miracle of Normandy was not that violence created peace. Violence alone cannot build for long. The miracle was that violence was captured by structure, disciplined by necessity, and made to serve continuity. Even so, we should not make the story too clean. The birth of Normandy was not a moral parable in which raiders became noblemen, and all wounds healed beneath church bells. There was suffering at the beginning. There were burned homes, emptied treasuries, frightened villages, stolen captives, broken families, and communities forced to live under masters they had not chosen. The glory of later Norman achievement rests upon a foundation that included fear. To remember Rollo honestly, we must hold both truths at once. He was a founder. He was also a man of violence. History asks us to resist comfort. It asks us to see the dead in their fullness. The people of the Viking Age were not monsters from the edge of civilization, nor were they romantic heroes free of guilt. They were human beings, capable of craftsmanship, poetry, loyalty, calculation, tenderness, and savagery. The Franks were not merely victims, nor were they simply civilized guardians against barbarism. They were rulers, priests, soldiers, farmers, and nobles living inside their own hierarchies of power and oppression. The meeting of these worlds was not light against darkness. It was human against human, and from that collision came something neither side could fully control. This is what makes the story endure. Rollo reveals the instability of identity. A pagan can become a Christian lord, a raider can become a defender, a foreigner can become an ancestor, a name feared in one generation can be honoured in another. The borders between enemy and founder, invader and ruler, outsider and native, are not fixed by nature. They are made by power, memory, marriage, language, law, and time. Time is the greatest sculptor. It wears away the raw edges of conquest. It turns camps into towns, strangers into forefathers, violence into origin myth, and political bargains into destiny. A child born in Normandy generations after Rollo would not remember the terror of the first fleets. He would know only that this was his land, his church, his lord, his language, his horizon. The extraordinary hardens into inheritance. The shock becomes tradition. And yet traces remain. The name Normandy still carries the memory of the Northmen. Rouen still anchors the landscape of Rollo's rise. The Seine still moves toward the sea, indifferent and eternal, as it did when ships first pushed inland under Northern command. Churches and towns have changed beyond recognition, but beneath them lie older layers, some known through stratigraphic excavation, others still hidden. Archaeology continues to remind us that history is not only written in chronicles, it lies in soil, bone, metal, pollen, timber, scarcesta, stone, and the chemistry of human remains. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Perhaps new excavations will clarify the earlier settlement patterns of Norse groups in Normandy. Perhaps genomic data will sharpen the picture of migration and intermarriage. Perhaps isotopic analysis will reveal more about who moved, who stayed, what they ate, and where they were born. Perhaps a forgotten text, copied in some distant medieval hand, will alter a detail we thought settled. The past is never entirely closed. It waits beneath the surface, patient as buried iron, but no discovery is likely to strip Rollo of mystery completely. Some questions belong to the realm of permanent twilight. Was he more Norwegian than Danish? Was he an exile, an opportunist, a nobleman, or a self-made warlord? Did he seek Normandy from the start? Or did ambition grow only after the Seine revealed its possibilities? Did baptism change his heart? Or only his political language did he die satisfied, fearful, proud, or haunted? No science can yet enter the inner chamber of a vanished soul, so we are left with the outline of a life and the magnitude of its consequences. Rollo built nothing alone, but without him the story takes another shape. He was the point around which forces gathered: Viking expansion, Frankish fragmentation, Christian political culture, river warfare, land hunger, and dynastic memory all met in him. He was not the sole cause of Normandy, but he was its first great symbol, its ancestral thunder, its sea-dark beginning. In the long road of human history, such figures remind us that civilization is not always born from calm fields and wise counsels. Sometimes it begins in terror, compromise, exhaustion, and the recognition that an enemy cannot be wished away. Sometimes the future is made not by defeating the outsider, but by binding him to the land until his children become the land's own defenders. Sometimes a kingdom survives by turning a sword at its throat into a sword at its gate. That is the unsettling genius of Rollo's story. It does not flatter us with simplicity. It tells us that identity is made, not given. It tells us that order can emerge from predation, but never without cost. It tells us that memory can sanctify what was once unbearable. It tells us that the line between destruction and creation may be crossed by men who do not understand the full meaning of their own steps. Rollo came from the north, from fog, salt, hunger, and legend. He entered the wounded lands of the Franks as a danger. He remained as a ruler. His descendants carried Norman ambition far beyond the Seine, into England, into the Mediterranean, into the architecture of medieval Europe itself. Yet at the centre of the storm remains the man, silent and unreachable, standing beside the river with one foot in the Viking age and one in the feudal world to come. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. And perhaps that is fitting, for the past is not a room we fully illuminate. It is a landscape at dusk. We walk through it with fragments, tools, questions, and imagination disciplined by evidence. We listen for voices beneath the wind. We search for foundations beneath grass. We read the fearful words of monks and the proud memories of descendants. We study graves, charters, names, and bones, and somewhere among them, Rollo waits. The Viking who built Normandy, the raider who became a lord, the stranger who became an ancestor, a man of iron, water, blood, and oath, whose shadow still lies across the map of Europe, and whose story reminds us that the world we inherit was often made by those who stood at the edge of ruin and chose, by ambition or necessity, to build